Thank you for inviting me. I cannot tell you how much of a pleasure it is to be here in the Netherlands, particularly living in Washington, D.C. for 2.5 years. Everybody here is so civil. I've been in National Museum of the American Indian for 2.5 years, and part of that, I was in Minneapolis, Minnesota, which, by the way, if you haven't been there, is a wonderful place. So either way, thank you for the invitation. I'll be doing a bit of reading my paper and also just sort of general talking, so we'll sort of go from there. The importance of collaborating and developing partnerships and or collecting with Native people is critical to the understanding, presentation, and interpretation of Native American culture. In fact, I come from the perspective that one is obligated to develop said relationships, or the project's validity is questionable. By representing a culture without proper Native partnerships that have significant input into the critical areas of the exhibition and educational materials, one presents a culture under false pretenses. It creates a romanticism that doesn't exist, creates education materials for children that reinforces stereotypes, promotes racial role-playing, and completely ignores the continued vitality of Native culture. And I don't think I need to say any more about this slide. But these ideas should not be new to us. Actually, a model was created for us to follow in the fall of 1972, 43 years ago in Minneapolis, Minnesota. Through a partnership with the Walker Art Center and the Minneapolis Institute of Art, the exhibition, American Indian Art Form and Tradition, was organized and opened in Minneapolis in October 1972. Walker director Martin Friedman wanted to ensure that the highest quality of Native artwork would be in the exhibition and that the Native American community would be involved at every level. Minneapolis-St. Paul is one of the largest Native American urban populations in the country. Through an alliance, where am I here? Okay. Through an alliance with many local Native organizations, including the American Indian Movement, which we know as AIM, an arrangement was created. The American Indian Art Alliance, a group that was created specifically for this exhibition, oversaw and had significant input in all aspects of the exhibition. For example, this alliance vetted all objects that was in the exhibition and had complete veto power for the works they felt would be inappropriate display. So that is to say that the curators traveled around the country documenting objects they wanted in their exhibition. They created an alliance of the Native American community in Minneapolis, and every object and idea that they wanted presented in the exhibition had to go through this alliance. The idea was that Martin Friedman, the director in 1972, wanted two things. Number one, he wanted the highest quality of work in the gallery, and number two, he wanted Native Americans to be involved at every single level. So that shifted the power of display and presentation from the museum to the local Native American community. And keep in mind, this happened 43 years ago. Where am I? Okay. So this work, the group that created, so this Educational Alliance group created educational program, had a series of Native artist talks in the gallery, had a Native children's show, a Native American fashion show, and a 3-day powwow. And Native American high school students as tour guides. So none of the tour guides in this exhibition were non-Native. Every single one of them was Native. They had 24 high school students that they had trained. So the visitor that came to the exhibition, which are the vast majority of non-Native, that's sort of the demographic, of Minneapolis and St. Paul, they were all toured by Native American high school students about the objects their ancestors created. During the opening of the exhibition, director Martin Friedman remarked, he asked the visitor if he had noticed a large amount of Native Americans at the exhibitions. He further commented, quote, "If they hadn't been here, the show would have been a failure," end quote. One must keep in mind that during this time was the height of Native American activism. A group of Indians had taken over Alcatraz just a couple of years earlier. The photo on the left is from Alcatraz when it was being taken over. The photo on the right, you notice a little young man there on the left, that's me. I happened to be there at Alcatraz when I was a young man. One is American Indian movement's Trail of Broken Treaties was moving across the country and headed to Washington, D.C., where it take over the Bureau of Indian Affairs office for several days. In 1972, as this caravan was traveling from the West Coast to Washington, D.C., it made a stop in Minneapolis. This caravan was over 300 vehicles, hundreds and hundreds of Native people on the way to Washington, D.C., and it was there when they were in Minneapolis, while this exhibition was open, that they created some protests. And this is the group in November of 1972 taking over Minneapolis City Hall. And the idea was that they wanted to demand equal rights for Native Americans. They wanted to demand that the administration then, which was the Nixon administration, recognize Native people more. So this Trail of Broken Treaties was on its way to Washington, D.C. to make a 20-point position paper. And this 20-point position paper ensured that lands that were sort of in question from the 1868 Fort Laramie Treaty returned to Native American people, that they have more self-governed, that they live up to the treaty rights. So this was sort of a big thing in 1972 among Native people and the movement. And while they were in Minneapolis, they took over the Bureau of Indian Affairs Minneapolis offices, and it was there that they demanded whether the Bureau of Indian Affairs either endorse or condone the caravan that happened to go through. As you look at this picture here, you see Russell Means there on the right, you see Dennis Banks there on the left, confronting the man in charge of the BIA at the Minneapolis office and asking him, what is their position on the march. Now, despite these issues, the museum still worked in a cooperative way with the Native American community, and particularly the American Indian movement. Actually, when the show was opened in Minneapolis, like I mentioned, in the fall of 1972, and the American Indian movement was at its full height in Minneapolis, the leaders of the caravan came to the museum demanding a tour of the exhibition. Now, as one can imagine, the American Indian movement at the time was the height of militancy. Keep in mind, 3 weeks prior to this, there was an archaeological dig by the Minnesota River of this old Native American village. And Clyde Belcourt and his group of American Indian movement had went to this site, had seized all the equipment, including the shovels, and created a bonfire and burned it all. So they're very much anti-establishment. But because the Walker Art Center and the Minneapolis Institute of Art, through this exhibition, worked in a cooperative and in a partnership way with the Native American community, the community backed and felt full partnership with the museum. So when this group of American Indian movement people came to the museum and demanded a tour, they did receive a tour, and as they walked around through the gallery, the director and the two curators walked with them around the gallery, were telling them about the objects, and were telling them about the relationship they had developed with the Native American community there in Minneapolis. And Dennis Banks, who was the most militant of all the American Indian movement, said, quote, "This is the most respectful display of Native American culture I've ever seen a non-Native do," end quote. So it really illustrates again that although the American Indian movement is very anti-establishment, even at the height of Native American activity and activism, it is possible for a large, mostly non-Native institution to work in a cooperative and partnership way with Native people. If we fast forward sort of the clock several years later, the National Museum of the American Indian Act was established in 1989, which essentially took over the collection of George Gustavus High. He was a rich collector who lived in New York, and after he passed, there was sort of some ideas of what to do with his collection. American Museum of Natural History wanted it. Even Ross Perot, a rich Texas, I guess you could call him a politician, wanted to buy the collection. And so there was a lot of sort of political jockeying around to figure out what to do with the collection. Then the Smithsonian decided to come in and says, no, that's not going to happen. We're going to take the collection over. So in 1989, the National Museum of the American Indian Act was passed, which essentially established the National Museum of the American Indian, the transfer of the High Collection, and also ensured the Smithsonian Institution, as well as the newly established NMAI, complied with repatriation law. And keep in mind, that is before NAGPRA, Native American Graves Protection and Repatriation Act. So this was kind of a big deal. And one must also keep in mind of the climate that happens in Washington, D.C., as well as even happens today. Keep in mind, we have one of the most offensive football team names in all of the National Football League, and it still very much is an active role within Washington, D.C. And as a Native person living in Washington, D.C., this is the sort of the issues that we have to deal with. So we deal with a non-Native public that often thinks as Native American culture within this context, and they refuse to understand that the term redskin is actually offensive. Now, in 1990, when the National Museum of the American Indian Board was established, their statement was, quote, "The National Museum of American Indian shall recognize and affirm to Native communities and the non-Native public the historical and contemporary culture and cultural achievements of Native Americans of the Western Hemisphere by advancing, in consultation, collaboration, and cooperation with natives, knowledge and understanding of Native cultures, including art, history, and language, and by recognizing the museum's special responsibility through innovative public programming, research, and collections to protect, support, and enhance the development, maintenance, and perpetuation of Native culture and community." So that's a lot to establish. That's sort of a large task that National Museum, the NMAI, did. But even with the building, the construction of the building, it was very important to incorporate these ideas into all aspects of NMAI within their early days. In fact, even the construction workers, as they were creating the building, were also being blessed and performed in Native American ceremonies as the building came along. Now, in the original, and we're going to get to this shortly, in what I call NMAI 1.0, in the first version of National Museum of the American Indian, it's different now. The three exhibitions took a community-curated approach in order to ensure the visitor heard the voice of Native people. NMAI worked with 24 communities throughout the Western Hemisphere, and the exhibition that I'm going to focus on briefly is Our Universe, which essentially talked about the philosophy in general, overall, of Native American culture, and also within this exhibition sort of highlighted specific communities. There were several communities within this large exhibition that each community had an opportunity to sort of talk about within their philosophy. And since, in a matter of time, I'm going a lot faster than I thought I was going to go, I'm just going to sort of briefly discuss the involvement with the UPIC. So as I mentioned before, part of the idea of NMAI 1.0 is to have Native communities bring their own voice to the visitors through the exhibition. So the UPIC were involved at every single level within the exhibition. So the first level, and here we can see when the team visited the UPIC community, they sat down with elders and they talked about what objects would be used and sort of what approach that they would go. And once they sort of made a selection of objects, they'd bring them to Washington, D.C., where they would examine the objects and provide their input, which would find themselves, within the label, within the text, as well as videos within the exhibition. Once they decided how what objects was going to be presented in the exhibition, it went back to Washington, D.C., where they would design the exhibition and make these little models of the exhibition. You can see here, they made these little tiny models, brought them back to the community so the community can sort of understand the layout and how it's going to work and sort of what feeling it's going to have for the visitor. And once they got to that point, they started writing what's called, I don't know what you call it here. At NMAI, they call it a script, which is essentially all the museum text. Script always sounds like a movie or something, but there they call it a script. So they essentially went over the script to ensure that they felt comfortable with it, suggested changes, and those changes happened. And not only was the relationship established with just the elders among the Yupik, but also they developed youth programs among each of the groups. This is the Yupik visiting National Museum of the American Indian in order to talk about these objects. So they also had NMAI not only presented Yupik culture through the eyes of Yupik, but also acted sort of as a place for transference of knowledge. So you have elders come and talk about these things. Then you have youth come there, not only learn about these things, but also talk about them as well. And then once the museum was open, the Yupik elders came to the opening, and there on the right you can see the group. On the left, the group of elders that got the chance to see that they actually became curators in this exhibition. So overall, that was, at least from our point of view, is considered a success. The impact in the gallery that expressed both historic and contemporary culture in a very different way had never been done before. The initial reviews of NMAI 1.0 by the Native community was absolutely through the roof. Everybody loved it. But by everybody else, particularly the media, and many museum people had a very strong dislike, actually many hated, if I can use that word, how the exhibition turned out. And I guess my question is, and sort of and this is all before my time, one of the things that I'm trying to understand is why such the negative impact? And I think what the problem is many people have an idea what a museum should be. But what makes NMAI, what I call 1.0, NMAI 1.0, is that it's the unmuseum. It is not how one expects a museum should present culture. People, the vast majority of people think that when you go to a museum, it needs to be presented in a linear format. Well, NMAI is very non-linear. It needs to show the vast majority of the collection. We have 850,000 objects. This museum doesn't have to show all of the objects. It doesn't have to have large presentations of objects. The idea of the first rendition of NMAI is to give Native people a voice within a museum, and I put museum in quotations, within a museum, that has never been done before. Because we know historically, and even today, is the vast majority of people who present Native American culture is often through non-Native anthropologists that have little contact with Native Americans, or they use them as consultants. And the problem with a consultant is that you can read your book over here, you can go through your archives over here, you can look at photographs over here, talk to Native people over here, but in a consultant relationship, you can reject their opinion. But I advocate a partnership where the museum professional works with Native American people in a partnership way. So the presentation, the display, and the philosophies that are presented in the exhibition need to go together like this. It's not one like this. They always need to go together like this. So in my point of view, that's sort of the reason why everybody had such a strong backlash with NMAIs, because they couldn't step out of their preconceived notions of what a museum should be. Personally, I think it shouldn't be called a museum. I don't know what it'd be called, because a museum has a very loaded context. National Museum of the American Indian has 3 facilities. It has one facility in New York at the old Customs House, and that had to stay there because when the collection left New York and came down to Washington, D.C., part of the agreement was that a presence of NMAI had to stay in New York. We have the museum on the mall, and just south of the mall, at about 6 miles, is what we call the Cultural Resources Center, and that's actually where I work. And the Cultural Resources Center was the first building built, and it houses all the collection, except for what is either out on loan or in the galleries. So that's 2% of the collection is not being, no, excuse me, only 2% of the collection is actually being seen. The rest we have housed down in collection. And also, this space was built not only for researchers, but also for native visitors. There's large areas where, I guess you could say the building is very, very native friendly. There's a lot of trees around, there's a lot of forest around. And we act as an area where native people and researchers can come down to the Cultural Resources Center and work with the collection. The vast majority we have are native people, either through repatriation or through researchers, come down and sort of reconnect with come down and reconnect with the objects that their ancestors created. So we have a lot of tribal delegation visits. I would argue that Cultural Resources Center, what we call CRC, is really the heart of NMAI and acts as a catalyst for the museum to reach out to Indian country. Part of the work that we do down at National Museum of the American Indian, down at the Cultural Resources Center, is we work with native people on how to store many of their objects, how to care for them. They actually come in and work with them from a conservation point of view. And also we have a lot of ceremonies, not only inside, but outside. We have a space within the museum that, let's see here, it's downstairs, it faces north. One side is all glass. So when native visitors want to come in and smudge or bless themselves, we accommodate that. It's close enough to the storage, we don't call it storage, we call it collection. It's close enough to the collection room where we can actually bring objects out into that room. And if the people from that tribe want to come in and pray with the object, we certainly accommodate that as well. Now, there has been a shift at National Museum of the American Indian in the past few years, what I call NMAI 2.0. It's a move away from community curated exhibitions, and it focuses the impact for Native people into educating non-Native people. There's a program there called the National Education Initiative, and the idea is, this comes down through the director, the idea is the best way to help Native people is to educate non-Native people about Native people. So what they're doing is they're creating this education material. All exhibitions, everything is all drive around what we call NEI, National Education Initiative. And what they're doing is they're working with educators at a national and a state and a local level, creating curriculum so this information can be incorporated into schools. And basically, what we found out is the vast majority of students in the United States learn about the classic things as one would think about whenever they talk about Native Americans. Of course, is Pocahontas, is Thanksgiving, maybe the Battle of Little Bighorn, or the American Indian Movement. And oftentimes they did a survey of textbooks and they found the vast majority of the time that this information is wrong. So the idea is that NMAI is working with schools on teaching teachers who eventually work with students to educate them more about Native people. And hopefully further down the line, the next generation, whatever the case may be, will have an impact with Native people. We have other ways that we're reaching out with Native people that weren't as strong before. We have a artist leadership program, and this is an opportunity for artists to come to National Museum of the American Indian down at the Cultural Resource Center and look at the objects objects from the tribe. They go back to the community and they work cooperatively to make impact within the community. Another one is we have the leadership program for museums and cultural cultural arts organizations. They essentially do the same thing. But once we sort of take another step sort of further back, sort of think about the next steps. Over the past several years, the focus of NMAI has changed, as I had mentioned before, and it often makes me think about what are the next steps. How can we sort of continue to ensure that museums, or at least provide, the museums are given a model of how to work with Native people. Because oftentimes when a museum tries to do this, they eventually have to reinvent the wheel. They have to go into the communities and figure out who to work with, these kind of things. I come from the perspective that the future is actually not that. The future is actually to work with tribal museums. There's over 100 tribal museums in many different communities all across the United States. And the tribal museums oftentimes represent, well, all the time, represent their own community within their own community. And it's best, from my point of view, to work with partnerships with these tribal museums because they obviously already know the community. They know who to work with. And oftentimes, they break the model of what a museum should be. They act as a cultural center, a place of exchange for knowledge. And also, part of their job is to also preserve cultural knowledge. So instead of having a museum outside of the community, you have a museum within the community. And I would argue the future of partnership working, a larger museum working with a tribal group is to go through the tribal museum. Now, a great model is actually in Zuni. It's Ashawi Awan Museum and Cultural Center in Zuni, Minnesota. This is run by Jim Enote. They have programs, they have mini exhibitions, and they work to enrich the community within a number of ways. And one of the things that Jim is doing is he created this database of all Zuni objects from all over the world, and he's been traveling around photographing and also creating documentation of Zuni material that is in museum collections outside of the Zuni community. What he does in the United States is once he develops this relationship, he works with the museum works with the museum's Zuni objects, and then he brings in Zuni elders, and the Zuni elders, Jim and the museum staff, talk about these objects, and then he asks the museum staff to leave. And it's within there, when you have just Zuni people talking about the object within their own language, is where sort of this reclamation of traditional knowledge really happens. That's where they I got too far ahead of myself. That's where they can really talk, and that's where sort of this repatriation of intellectual knowledge happens, and all this material eventually finds itself back within the Zuni community. Now, in the United States, there are a couple of notable examples of where anthropology museums have worked, at least from my point of view, positive with Native American communities. One example is the Sam Noble Museum. They worked with a Kiowa. There's a man by the name of Dan Swan who runs that, and they worked in a very cooperative way when they recreated their black leggings teepee. I don't have pictures of that, but it's a really phenomenal model. Secondly, his most important project, I think, to date, is working on Osage wedding traditions. And it was there where the Sam Noble Museum went to the Osage Tribal Museum, and they worked in a partnership in order to present this material. The next and last example is Heather Autone, who's Native. She works at the Fred Jones Museum at the University of Oklahoma. She worked with the Hopi, and again, it's very much of a partnership way. She went to the community, she brought the community to the museum, and they helped create text and had a strong amount of input on how this material should be presented. So sort of as we think about this and sort of take a step back, at least in my mind, one of the things I'm wrestling with is, how do we resolve this issue where we have oftentimes the community over here and we have museums over here who want to present the community over here within the museum over here. right? So one of the things that I'm a large advocate for, and one of the things I think we need to think about in the future is, what if we train Native people over here to be curators over here? So this way we no longer have to work with the tribe because we have representatives of the tribe within the museum. So no longer are their culture being presented by somebody outside of their culture, but instead the culture is being presented by members of the culture. One of the things that we're doing at the National Museum of the American Indian is we're developing 2 fellowship programs. Well, that's actually what we're doing. We're creating a fellowship where Native people can come into the museum and be trained and either go back to their community to work as a museum professional, or they're trained to work as a museum professional throughout any museum within the United States. So from my point of view, as we sit here and discuss this, we also need to think about the next steps, because as you know, it's been a very, very long time since Native people has had a chance to have input on how their culture is presented. In my point of view, it is our moral obligation to be able to give Native Americans the tools through education and through training in order to give them the opportunity to present their own culture within a non-Western institution. Thank you.